There is a truth that very few people are brave enough to name, not because it is complex, but because saying it out loud forces us to face something we have felt for a long time. It is the moment you realize that your pain is still fully present, while the person who caused it moves forward as if the surface of the water was never disturbed. No noise, no explanation, no sign of remorse. Just a calmness so cold it makes your emotions feel like a minor detail, something easily dismissed. And within that calmness, something unsettling begins to surface. Not quite anger, not entirely sadness, but a deep internal misalignment. You begin to wonder whether you are feeling too much, whether you are holding on to something you should have already let go. But your intuition whispers something else. Because there are wounds that do not disappear simply because someone else pretends they never existed. There are fractures that only reveal themselves when someone smiles too quickly after causing you pain. And at that fragile intersection between what you feel and what they deny, something begins to take shape, slowly but irreversibly. And in today's video, I will walk with you straight into this question. Why, after hurting you, they are able to behave as if nothing ever happened, and what is truly happening inside you when your pain is treated as though it never existed. And it is precisely from the moment you begin to ask that question that an uncomfortable but necessary truth starts to surface. Their calmness is not accidental, it is a psychological reflex reinforced over many years. A narcissist does not forget the pain they cause in the way you might forget a small detail from your day. They remember, but they remember selectively. In their inner world, everything must serve one primary function: protecting the ego. Anything that threatens the image they hold of themselves as justified, reasonable, or fundamentally good becomes something that must be minimized, distorted, or erased altogether. And your pain, unfortunately, often falls directly into that category. When they act as if nothing happened, they are not simply avoiding a conversation, they are avoiding the experience of facing themselves. Because acknowledging your pain would require admitting something far more destabilizing, that they are capable of causing harm. And for someone whose identity is built on superiority and emotional invulnerability, that admission feels existentially dangerous. So instead of repairing, they erase. Instead of reflecting, they move forward as if the ground behind them never cracked. Their calmness is not emotional strength, it is a crude defense mechanism. If they do not name what happened, then it does not exist. And if it does not exist, they do not have to take responsibility for it. You, however, the one who feels deeply, stand on the opposite side of the same moment. You carry the emotional memory of what happened, the tone of their voice, the look in their eyes, the silence that followed, the tightening in your chest. Your nervous system cannot simply reset to normal because it knows something has been broken. And it is this mismatch that creates the deepest confusion. You are processing a real emotional event, while the other person is behaving as if that reality never occurred. This is where disorientation begins, not because you are weak, but because you are inside a dynamic where your reality is not acknowledged. And when pain is denied, it does not disappear, it turns inward, quietly teaching you to doubt your own perception. What drives you to the edge is not only the wound they caused, but the moment they look directly at you, see that you are hurting, and then continue living as if that wound never existed. The cruelty is not confined to the original act. It lies in what comes after: the carefully timed calm, the casual demeanor, the effortless normalcy presented just precisely enough to trap your mind between two opposing realities. On one side is the emotional memory still alive in your body. On the other is the everything is fine atmosphere they deliberately perform. When these two collide, you do not just feel pain, you lose orientation. In everyday psychology, this phenomenon is often described as emotional amnesia, a selective erasure of emotional reality. But this does not mean they truly forget. A more accurate description is that they delete psychologically. They do not erase the event from the timeline, they erase its emotional and moral significance. They shrink it, blur it, or relabel it as something trivial so they never have to step into the most dangerous territory for them: accountability. Because, For a personality structure organized around ego preservation, accountability is not maturity, it is a threat. It is important to understand this clearly. Not everyone who displays narcissistic behaviors meets the criteria for a personality disorder. Many people show narcissistic traits situationally, especially when their self-image is threatened, when they feel exposed, or when they fear losing control. Research suggests that narcissistic personality disorder itself is relatively uncommon in the general population, with average prevalence estimates hovering around 1%, though figures vary depending on methodology. This distinction matters because what you are facing is not necessarily a diagnosis, but a psychological power mechanism, a way of relating in which preserving one's image takes precedence over honoring another person's lived experience. And when image becomes a form of worship, truth is often sacrificed to keep the altar standing. So how does emotional amnesia actually function? It works like a reset button, pressed at precisely the right moment. After causing harm, they may immediately shift into a different state. Casual conversation, light texting, joking, even apparent warmth. This behavior is not meant to repair, it is meant to reframe the environment. Once the environment is reset, the thing you are still holding, your pain, your boundary, your truth, suddenly feels out of place. And when a sensitive, emotionally attuned person stands inside a room that is performing normal, the most human response emerges. You begin to doubt yourself first. This is the most insidious part. They do not need to say, "I didn't do that." Their behavior alone forces your brain into a survival calculation. If they seem calm, maybe I misunderstood. If they are acting normal, maybe I am exaggerating. If they are unaffected, maybe I am too sensitive. This process aligns with cognitive dissonance. When your internal reality clashes with the external narrative being presented, the nervous system seeks relief by choosing the explanation that creates the least immediate conflict. And that explanation is often, "The problem must be me." The moment self-doubt takes hold, power quietly shifts. You are no longer standing on your truth, you are requesting permission. Permission to be hurt, permission to be angry, permission to speak. And this is where gaslighting enters, not as a storm, but as fog, subtle, repetitive, persistent. Gaslighting does not always appear as overt denial. Sometimes it is a shrug, a half smile, a dismissive comment framed as humor. "Here we go again." Sometimes it is a short sentence. "Why bring up the past?" Sometimes it is the coldest maneuver of all, the sudden pivot where the issue is no longer what they did, but your tone, your timing, your reaction. This is the act of shifting the center of gravity, turning you into the problem so they never have to face their own behavior. And if you are someone with conscience, empathy, and the capacity for self-reflection, you will be pulled into an endless loop of self-examination. You soften your words, you regulate your emotions, you wait for the right moment. You try to explain more clearly, more gently, more rationally, hoping that this time they will finally hear you. But the more you refine your delivery, the more you reinforce a dangerous belief that your experience only matters if they agree with it. This is where exhaustion begins. Because you are performing a task no one should ever have to perform, asking the person who caused the harm to validate the reality of that harm. You are standing in front of someone whose psychological survival depends on never being wrong, hoping they will hand you the very thing that destabilizes them: accountability. They may offer attention, they may offer reassurance, they may offer a temporary sense of calm to pull you back in, but what you need most, a clear acknowledgement that they acted wrongly and that it caused harm, is often what they avoid at all costs. The turning point, then, is not when you win an argument. The turning point is when you see the structure of the game, when you understand that emotional amnesia is not a lapse, but a method of keeping their image spotless. When you recognize that gaslighting is not a single sentence, but a system designed to blur reality. When you see that you are being trained to doubt yourself, something shifts. You stop asking for permission. You stop trying to make your pain reasonable enough to be accepted. You hold your memory as living evidence. You hold your truth as a backbone, and most importantly, you revoke their access to your nervous system. Because when someone repeatedly denies your pain, the issue is no longer whether they understand it. The issue is that they benefit from your confusion. And the moment confusion dissolves quietly, internally the dynamic begins to lose its grip. No drama, no confrontation, just a simple, irreversible shift. You are no longer living inside a script they wrote. There is a very specific moment in this journey, and it is far quieter than most people expect. It does not arrive with a dramatic confrontation, nor with tears, nor with a confession from the other person. It arrives softly, almost invisibly. And the only one who truly notices it is you. It is the moment your mind stops trying to understand them. For a long time, you have been doing the emotional labor for two people. You analyzed their behavior. You searched for hidden motives behind every word. You placed yourself in their position, trying to explain their avoidance, their denial, their ability to act as if nothing happened. You believed that if you understood deeply enough, spoke carefully enough, waited patiently enough, the truth would eventually be acknowledged. And then, a colder realization emerges. They are not lacking understanding. They are lacking incentive to understand. At this point, something critical shifts within your nervous system. Instead of continuing to spiral through explanation, your brain begins to register something else. Pattern. You stop seeing isolated incidents and start recognizing structure. Harm occurs. Your emotional reality is dismissed. A manufactured calm appears. Responsibility is avoided. And if you persist, you become the problem. When a sequence repeats often enough, it is no longer misunderstanding. It is a system. Awakening does not come through rage. It comes through the refusal to negotiate with reality. You stop asking, "Am I too sensitive?" and begin asking a far more accurate question. Why, in this relationship, is my emotional experience always the thing that must be justified? That question is not about blame. It is about reclaiming orientation. And once orientation shifts, something very tangible happens. You withdraw emotional participation, not with dramatic coldness, but with clarity. You stop chasing ambiguous signals. You stop rewriting the story so it will be easier for them to accept. You stop reshaping yourself to fit a version of normal designed to erase your pain. You pause and you observe. From that vantage point, you begin to see what distance reveals. They need ambiguity far more than you need clarity, because clarity would force confrontation with what they have done. Ambiguity keeps you engaged, and the moment you stop accepting ambiguity as peace, the system begins to malfunction. This is the core truth. You do not awaken by proving they are wrong. You awaken by no longer needing them to admit that you are right. You hold your memory. You hold your perception. You hold your lived experience without outsourcing its validity to the very person who denied it in the first place. And right here, the balance of power begins to tilt, not because you did something aggressive, but because you stopped doing the thing that made you disappear. The moment you stop negotiating with reality, your silence stops being saying nothing and becomes a biological decision and a psychological strategy. You cut the supply. Before this, a narcissist does not need you to love them, they need you to react. Your tears are data, your anger is fuel, your long messages explaining yourself are proof that they still sit at the center of your nervous system. And the key point is this: they are not always calculating like a criminal mastermind. Much of what they do is instinctive ego protection. But the outcome is the same. They learn that if they create a big enough emotional shock, you will rush in to repair, and that keeps them in control of what counts as real and what gets dismissed as not a big deal. So when you move into deliberate silence, not silence to punish, but silence to revoke access, you hit their core weakness, their dependence on other people's feedback to keep their self-image intact. This is where their manufactured normal starts to crack. You often see a predictable phenomenon in any control system when it loses traction: escalation. Behavioral psychology describes this as an extinction burst when a tactic that used to work suddenly fails. the manipulator typically intensifies it, faster and harder, trying to regain the old results. That is why your silence rarely produces immediate insight. Instead, they test every key on the ring of power. They begin with sweet bait, casual check-ins, fake concern, nostalgia, a soft, "I miss you," as if your pain never existed. Then shift to poisoned bait, sarcasm, coldness. Then destabilization disappear and reappear, hot and cold, and if that still fails, they may activate the public script, pulling third parties in, shaping a story where you look too sensitive, difficult, unable to let things go. None of this is about understanding you. It is about restoring the old order where your emotions move to their rhythm. And here is the colder truth. What they call peace is often just your silence after you have erased yourself. So when your silence means the opposite silence that still holds memory, still holds truth, they panic, not because they lose you, but because they lose the tool. They survive by making you doubt your perception, and your silence is the one thing they cannot rewrite with words. When you do not respond, they have no material to flip the narrative. When you do not explain, they have nothing to cut and splice. When you do not react, they have no evidence to argue that you are the problem too. At that point, their panic tends to appear through three masks. Innocence, playing confused, acting harmless to pull you back into conversation, victimhood, self-pity, claiming they are hurt, reframing you as cruel for having boundaries, and threat, cut-offs, cruelty, exposure, anything that forces a reaction. Different masks, same goal, to return you to the old position, the position where you must prove you have the right to be hurt. Deliberate silence is not a mind game to beat them. It is how you step out of a structure that demands you trade truth for a temporary calm. And when you hold silence that way, what collapses is not merely the relationship, it is their illusion of power, the illusion that they can harm you and then decide when the harm is allowed to end. And it is precisely at this point that what matters most is no longer what they do next, but what you are doing with your own nervous system. Because after all, the analysis of manipulation, emotional amnesia, escalation, and panic when control is lost, one core question remains, one that very few people are taught how to answer. How do you actually get out? Not just behaviorally, but biologically and psychologically. In controlling relationships, power does not primarily live in words or actions. It lives in continuous access to your nervous system. Every time you wait for a message, every time your chest tightens when they go silent, every time you regulate yourself to keep the peace, you are allowing another person to govern your biological rhythm. This is why understanding narcissistic behavior is not enough. Insight is cognitive. Freedom requires rewiring the nervous system. From this point forward, empowerment is not about confrontation. It is a quieter, deeper, and far more effective process. You revoke access. You do not revoke it with declarations or explanations. You revoke it by changing reflexes. Before, an ambiguous message could trigger hours of rumination, anxiety, self-blame. Now, you learn to pause at the level of the body, increased heart rate, pressure in the chest, a knot in the stomach. You stop chasing the narrative in your mind. You stay with the biological signal and let it pass, without performing a repair action. This is where many people falter, because they confuse non-reaction with defeat. In reality, this is where control begins to return at the deepest level. Even more critically, when you revoke access to your nervous system, you also revoke access to identity. In toxic dynamics, identity becomes distorted around managing the other person's emotional state. You become the regulator, the understanding one, the one who does not make things worse. True empowerment begins when you detach your self-worth from their reactions. You stop measuring yourself by whether they are calm, responsive, or validating. You measure yourself by a different question. Am I honoring my own signals right now? For this reason, the process rarely feels like victory at first. It may feel empty, disorienting, even sad. When you are no longer pulled into emotional intensity, a brain accustomed to high arousal will seek stimulation. This does not mean you are failing. It means you are detoxing. detoxing from the adrenaline of chaos, detoxing from the belief that safety comes from fixing. And, like any detox, this phase requires internal discipline, not more analysis. At this stage, a subtle but decisive shift occurs. They may still reach out, attempt to pull you back, press the old buttons, but those buttons no longer connect directly to reflex. There is a pause. And inside that pause, power changes hands. You have choice. You have space. You no longer react to end discomfort. You act, if at all, from clarity. For a narcissistic system, this is intolerable because it depends on immediate reaction from others. When reaction disappears, they lose their foothold in your mind. Ultimately, empowerment is not about becoming someone else. It is about returning to who you were before, living in constant alert. You sleep more deeply. You think more slowly, but more clearly. You no longer need to retell the story for someone else to believe it, because you believe yourself. And in that state, a quiet truth emerges. You do not need them to collapse for you to be free. Freedom begins the moment you stop allowing anyone else to define your emotional reality. That is not a loud victory. It is the true end of the game. And then, after everything, you arrive at a realization the narcissist never anticipated. Your healing is not recovery for return, it is recovery for permanent exit. Their relationships are built on a silent assumption that unresolved pain will keep you tethered, that unprocessed wounds will force you to keep seeking answers from the very person who caused them. When genuine healing begins, that assumption collapses. Healing, in this context, is not a pleasant emotional state. It is not about feeling better or thinking positively. Healing is a deep structural reorganization where you stop searching for closure externally and grant yourself the authority to close the loop. It is the moment you understand that not every story requires a final conversation. Some stories end when you stop turning back. At a deeper level, healing occurs when you withdraw the energy once trapped in trying to understand them, explain them, decode their behavior. Before, much of your psychological bandwidth was consumed by the question, why did they do this? Now, that question no longer holds power, not because you found a perfect answer, but because you no longer need one to live forward. Your attention shifts from analyzing another person to listening to yourself, a shift the narcissistic system cannot tolerate because it cuts off its most vital supply. Attention fueled by pain. This is precisely where healing becomes power. Not power to control, but power to no longer be controlled. You notice concrete changes. You no longer feel compelled to prove that you were hurt. You no longer need validation that your experience was real. You no longer live in anticipation of a response from them to feel finished. A quiet settles, not emptiness, but an internal space where intrusion is no longer possible. Psychologically, this is the phase where identity is restored. You are no longer the person who was treated that way, but the person who exited the system entirely. You do not carry the story as an open wound, you carry it as integrated information. This creates a fundamental shift in how you enter future relationships, no longer from lack or hope of repair, but from wholeness and clarity. And that clarity leaves old patterns with nowhere to attach. For the narcissist, this represents total defeat, not because you confronted them, but because you are no longer within their field of influence. They may rewrite the story however they choose. They may cast themselves as justified, misunderstood, or heroic. It no longer matters, because that story no longer lives inside you, and their power dependent entirely on occupying the internal world of others ends here. Ultimately, this must be said clearly. Healing is not a moral virtue, nor a requirement to be the bigger person. It is a survival choice. You heal not to demonstrate transcendence, but to ensure your nervous system, identity, and life are no longer occupied. When you live from a healed state, there is no need to defeat anyone. The game ends simply because you stop playing. And that is the final act, quiet, decisive, and irreversible. If you have listened this far and recognized yourself in this story, the most important thing to take with you is not anger and not sadness, but clarity. Clarity that when they act as if nothing happened after hurting you, it is not because you misunderstood, not because you are too sensitive, but because this behavior protects their ego and preserves their sense of control. Clarity that you cannot force someone to acknowledge your pain if doing so threatens the identity they rely on to survive. And clarity that the more you explain, the more you wait for accountability, the deeper you are pulled into a loop that erodes your sense of reality. The advice for you, whether you are already in it, in the process of leaving, or only standing at the edge of a relationship like this, is to trust your lived experience before you trust another person's calmness. Pay attention to your body when it tightens, to your mind when it is repeatedly pushed into self-doubt, and to your emotions when they are consistently asked to tone it down, let it go, or stop making a big deal out of it. That is not love, and it is not emotional maturity. It is an environment where their comfort is prioritized over your reality. You do not need to win the conversation, force an admission, or receive a closure they are unwilling to give. What you need is to withdraw their access to your inner world, hold on to your memory, protect your truth, and allow yourself to step out of a game that was never fair to you in the first place. When you stop seeking validation from someone who denies your pain, it is not failure, it is the clearest sign that you have begun to protect yourself. And sometimes, the deepest healing does not come from having everything said, but from being conscious enough to walk away without needing to say anything at all.